I trust you're having a great conference and hopefully super excited about the three new seminal security announcements. The HIPAA compliance now with the AWS starter kit in AWS, the multi-table extract capability now that will make row-level security far more efficient, and then the one announced today, the encryption at rest of data. So I know certainly as a sales consultant in the state and local government practice, my customers are very excited about that because many of them are healthcare focused. They're healthcare agencies where they have a lot of sensitive, personally identifiable information, whether they're tracking, whether it's public safety agencies tracking inmate populations or Department of Education's tracking students and student information. So clearly, the three big announcements are going to make a huge impact. So Douglas Chope, I'm based out of the Boston area, and I hope we have some Red Sox fans. And I think the gray hair is either the 25 years of thinking of security or chasing around three teenagers. Not sure which, but it's likely not the extracurriculars like coaching soccer and running and all that. I think the teenagers do it to you every time. As far as an agenda, I'm going to talk about data security as one of four fundamental tenets of enterprise security. Talk about the other three in conjunction and how it's critical that you think of it in a platform enterprise type of way because security is only as strong as your weakest link. I'm going to focus on some desktop-centric approaches, talking about best practice use of extracts and live connections in combination to allow you to go from an aggregate view where you may be looking at counts to, and maybe those are driven off of extracts, to personally identifiable information that you're then going to go and authenticate against the database, and we're going to have an extra layer of security for that, but show you how you can do that in combination. I'll talk about best practices around row-level security. I will certainly start with a primer. If you didn't have an opportunity to attend my colleague Brian Howell, Ron Duggar, and actually his brother John Duggar's presentation either yesterday afternoon or already has occurred this morning, I highly recommend you listen to that replay at your leisure because that's at the Jedi level, but a lot of really good advanced techniques about how to approach row-level security, particularly when data is distributed or federated, because sometimes you need to take advanced approaches, such as the use of what we call initial SQL, stored procedures, URL parameters, etc. And then I'll talk about some of the techniques that some of my customers have used. I'll even show you a couple live examples where they are starting with personally identifiable type of information, let's say health information. They're presenting it to the public. One of the great things about working with state and local government is not only all the great services that they offer and the high value they're offering the population, but they have the mandate in many cases to be fully transparent with the data. So most of my agencies that I work with make a lot of the data available to the public so the public can see how they're spending money, how services that they're offering are tracking, how the programs are doing, how are students faring, et cetera. So I'll talk about aggregation of data, blurring of data, redacting it, recoding it, and doing it dynamically within desktop calculated fields. You'll have my workbook So if there's a number of examples in there that are patterned after work I've done with my customers, so if we don't get to every single example, please take a look at those and then certainly reach out if you'd like to discuss those. I'll also talk about how core Tableau Server is, of course, to this whole security approach through use of published data sources, the data authentication, the logging and tracking and monitoring of activity, etc. I have my cards here. I'll be available throughout the conference if you'd like to talk more about any aspect of security I don't get to, or please feel free to reach out after the conference. I often find that sometimes it's just very helpful to understand your particular scenario because obviously Tableau is going to leverage your security environment, whether it's your authentication scheme, your database authentication approach, etc. Oftentimes I'll get into very in-depth discussions around these 4 layers that you see here, the authentication being the first, right? Is Douglas Chope who he says he is? And of course, that could be from very standard types of authentication schemes like Active Directory, where we'll automatically sync with your Active Directory user repository store and pull in IDs as we need it, but the passwords remain in Active Directory, to LDAP, to even custom authentication approaches using third-party identity providers, such as a Ping Federate, SiteMinder, OneLogin. Many of my customers will use the Tableau site approach, right, where each site is a single tenant in a strict multi-tenant type of concept so that they can have different authentication schemes for each site. So, for example, I work with the state of New York, and let's say the Department of Buildings will have a single-factor authentication approach, whereas the Department of Health has a multi-factor authentication approach through a separate IDP provider. So again, they'll have a token and a user ID, password, credentials. Authorization is our standard permissioning. What type of capabilities can we do? Can we download data? Obviously, most of my customers restrict the ability to download data or download workbooks, of course. We want to set that up in a granular way, of course, and do so with groups and projects so that we do it at the highest level possible, but override, in the case of groups, with individual users, or in the case of projects with sub-projects, or even lower it with content, only in an exception. But of course, there always are exception bases. An in-depth dive into data security. Network security, we'll be looking at encryption in flight. Many of my customers are using dual reverse proxies. They're using dual firewalls. So again, I'll be touching on some of those aspects, but if something like that is of interest to you and you want to talk about that further, please let me know. So with that, one question for the audience: how many of you have publicly facing type of reporting requirements where you want to share data with the public? Great. Good, because again, I would say about 80% of my agencies do exactly that. I'm just going to minimize PowerPoint and jump right into Tableau. So actually, the New York State Department of Health, which I work with, has a great framework for thinking about data, which helps drive all the decisions they make about their security approach and the trade-offs that they have with the security in each of these levels, right? And it can be anywhere from the fully aggregate level, where they're going to present that to the public, all the way down so that's at level 5, all the way down to the level 1, where it's personally identifiable information, or PHI, personal health information. And it, of course, dictates who can see what data, how they're going to lock it down, how they're going to audit and track at what level of granularity. because clearly the more sensitive the data, the more audit and tracking and logging we want to do. And with that, we'll drive the core requirements. And so if we want to restrict personally identifiable, yes. Oh, thank you very much. Where did that? Let me just close. There we go. All right, so you know what? As I was saying, this is the framework here that just allows us to talk through the various approaches to data at various levels, right? And again, I'll be showing you some examples where agencies are making either individual inmate data, individual student data, or health data available to the public. In fact, the great customer reference yesterday from Adam during the keynote to Florida Department of Juvenile Justice is one of my customers, where some great work by Mark Russell to present that information to the public in an aggregate way so that the public can see the value of the new reforms in terms of keeping juveniles out of prison. And so I have other examples like that, and I can show you some of the techniques that agencies like the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice use. So from a core requirements perspective, if we have PII data, then of course we really need encryption at rest, which is coming, but also techniques like hybrid best practice use of live connection and extract, which I'll show, can be very valuable. Even if we have aggregate data, like counts that we're making available to the public, we still want to ensure that as the public starts to drill on that data, it maybe goes from a higher level, let's say region, and just a high-level region view, but all of a sudden, you're starting to drill down into the zip code, and then we're looking at it by gender, and maybe veteran status, and by demographic. We need to be careful not to allow somebody to back into what we call a minimum n value, such that all of a sudden we can start to identify individuals potentially at too small a number. I'll talk about a couple dynamic Tableau calculations that either suppress or aggregate data accordingly or redact. And then role level security, of course, which is at the core. I'll be jumping into that in just a minute. And Tableau server, of course, right at the heart of all this, that through the published data sources and the ability to control the authentication to the data. So role level security is just ensuring that data is personalized for each user. Individuals or users see the right data at the right time, either based on their role or some type of credential or aspect about them. Typically, it's a username. Best practice might be a combination of both of those. And just to do a quick level set, what I typically see is when you're doing this, you're leveraging the database or a data source for what I call the entitlements or the authorization. Okay, this user, South user 1, can see the South region, right? And so it's a mapping, direct mapping of what the user to the data they can see. And then we would just join then on the orders or the performance type of data to that user credentials entitlements table. And this is what has been a problem to date, because trying to do this with an extract, which ideally you want to use for performance, would tend to lead to a data explosion, and that's why the multi-table extract feature that just got announced, and I'll be actually showcasing an example of this. That's where this new feature will certainly help here. Alternatively, we may have one row for each data that we want to filter. And that helps on the data explosion issue, but can make the query a bit more, require it to be more sophisticated, may have some performance impact. And so there are three core options then to row-level security. We can either do it all in the database, just based on if each user has individual credentials to the database. I'll be focusing primarily on option number 2, which is what all my customers use, and that's the best practice hybrid of using Tableau, application security, and the database, right? Where, again, we're going to create filters either at the workbook level or ideally at the data source level that will allow us to join directly to the database, that entitlements table. We'll also use that in combination with group membership in Tableau, and that will get us to a granular filtering of the data. And again, I'm going to demo that in just a minute. It's going to create a where clause that will follow us around. And then I'll touch briefly on user-level filtering when you don't have an entitlements table, but it's certainly considered more of a manual approach, and for many types of data, sensitive data, certainly is not a best practice. So that last option that I just got finished saying is certainly works, but for most of my customers would not be practical. It's the idea that we're going to create a user filter directly in Tableau Desktop, and you can do it, as I said, at the workbook level or at the data source level. If you do it at the data source level, it is technically immutable, meaning you can lock it down. And so let's actually jump right in, and I'll demo this. So let me just exit out of here and go right into Tableau Desktop. So what I'm getting at here is if I were to come in, let me show you first off what that looks like. Just allows us to create a mapping here between each user, right? Allows me to say, well, Alex Baldwin is the dean. By the way, quick context setting. This is some 3,500 students' data, a lot of personally identifiable information that will make a great data set for showing you some of the PII type of restriction shortly. But let's say we wanted to allow Alec Baldwin as dean of the business school to look at only the College of Business, and Tom Cruise as the dean of the engineering school only to view engineering data. So I just create the user filter, and exactly the way we do that is we would just come up here and I would say, right from the server dropdown, I would just say create a user filter here, and I could say right on college, and again, I could just come in here and manually map, right, just like I did. And again, but that's a manual process, and as we know, anytime there's manual processes involved, sometimes they're prone to break. So when we do that, that allows us to come down here and, well, first, I'll go to the emulator, but first what we would want to do is either add this set directly up here to the filter, which we could do on a worksheet or workbook basis. But as I mentioned, the best practice actually, because otherwise a user could remove that, particularly if they could download the workbook, the best practice here is to right-click on Edit Data Source Filter and actually add this right into the data source filter, right? And then if you restrict the download of the data source, then it's technically immutable. And then that allows us, what that gives us is this ability to going to Tableau Server, where we can come in here and just emulate the view. So if I go to Alec Baldwin, for example, I can see just the College of Business, right? And so when he's drilling as dean, he's only able to see data within the College of Business. Or let's say Tom Cruise, and we'll emulate him. And again, these would have to be users to find on Tableau server. So now I can see Tom Cruise could come in here and only have access to engineering data. And then if I emulate back to my credentials here, you can see all the college data. So that's option number one, the user level filter, which certainly works when you don't have the entitlements type of structure in the back-end data. I want to now introduce what I call option 2 and 3 around true role level security, leveraging either, again, the database or the Tableau group membership, or ideally both. So starting up here in the top right, actually, just to start with the database focused, if I have a column in the database here, salesperson, what I can do is Tableau, as a parameter, I can send the full name, and as long as there's a match there in the data, then data will be returned for that user. If we don't have the entitlements table, then we could also consider the group security. So as long as I'm an is member of, as long as I'm a user assigned to that group with appropriate permissions to that data source, then the is member of will give me access to the data. Here's what I would call is really the true best practice, is if we combine those. So we have a is member of type of look to the data, as long as I'm in the sales manager group, or as long as my full name equals the salesperson. And then you can even get more granular and a bit more sophisticated, looking at other kinds of filtering that you're applying using the contains breakout. And even one other good example here that let's see. Come on, it's not. Oh, here we go. So this is just to show you one more time what that would look like. So I have up on Tableau server, which we're seeing a snapshot of, I have the groups of users. And so just to keep this really straightforward, let's say I have a user sees all regions, and then user region central. So users assigned to that group only see the central region. And then I could have a calculated field that looks just like this, that just says, is that user a member of, and then is region, a field in the database, also set to, let's say in the case of central, the central value. So let's take a quick look at what that looks like from a demo perspective. So what we're going to see here is now I have a filter that, in the case of looking strictly at username here, just again takes that username Tableau parameter, passes it to the user's field, and where there's a match, show me the data. And again, just to hear what we're seeing over here on the left is where we've done that join between that user college mapping. So we have a users, as I mentioned, right where we have each user, and we can see, for example, that mapping and how that data looks here. And that just allows us to, again, to do that mapping, and so that when we do that, we can see here that I could come in and like before, change that from Tom Cruise, again, based on his user mapping in the database. If we look at what that looks like from the perspective of the group membership, you see here I just put up in the title here, as you know, you can insert various dynamic parameters right into the title, and all I'm doing is just inserting, of course, full and username just so to illustrate this. And now if I just change this back to, let's say, Douglas Chope, because in this particular case, Tom Cruise is not a member in the appropriate group, but I change from, let's say, Douglas Chope to an alias Douglas Chope, who only has group membership to the College of Engineering. Actually, so what I'd like to do now is just switch back and show you a couple very dynamic examples of, well, to sum up, again, the approach I would recommend is the hybrid using Tableau application level security with the database security, and using the group membership in conjunction with the database entitlements table that will create that where clause that follows each end user around. And this is the most secure and also performant way to do it, and it's easiest to manage. Because, of course, as with a lot of things that we deploy, there's always considerations around the maintenance, the performance, and the security. And I'm confident that this approach will give you the best of all three of those. So now what I'd like to do is touch on the new multi-table extract capability, because this will really enhance that joining to an entitlements table. And so let me just actually pop into Tableau Desktop 2018.3, which should be expected to be available very shortly. What I'm going to do is I'm going to connect to some Excel data here, and I'm not sure why that didn't come right up with, and what we'll do is we're actually going to see that here we go. I've got data, performance type data, and a entitlements. So here's what that entitlements data looks like, right? Just a user tied to the subcategory that they can look at, and then 250,000 rows of Superstore data. So if I drag that into the data connection, and then as you see, it's going to take just a bit to clock the 250,000 rows. What I'll do first is create the single table extract. And what you'll notice is it's about a minute, generates 15 million rows of data, 15 million rows of data because of the data explosion issue that occurs. And because what we need, again, is we need that join, and if users are allowed to see multiple regions, that type of one-to-many will result in the data explosion. And so now if I just drag out the entitlements and just say I want to join on subcategory here, and I'll say extract, and just to confirm, I'm going to do the single table, which has been the only option to date. And when I do that, of course, when we go to a worksheet, we'll be prompted here to save. I'll just call this the one table option approach. And you're going to see here it's going to take, could take up to a minute. One thing I want to point out is that, and the point was made when it was introduced yesterday, that not all aspects of extract processing work phase one with this release. So, for example, incremental updates are not supported with the multi-table extract approach. So certainly something to consider. And also, it's one of those, mileage will vary based on the use case. Certainly, row-level security, I think, is one of the very best use cases for the multi-table extract. But I know that phase two, phase three, they're going to address any shortfalls in terms of the initial functionality that may not be supported, like the incremental update, and continue to work on the performance for all use cases, right? But this will be very exciting when, as was conveyed during the keynote, now an extract can actually look like your underlying data source, right? So we're no longer just flattening out that extract in a highly denormalized way. It's actually going to be very representative of your data source, which will also have great analytical value in terms of writing far less LODs. So now that I've created that extract in well over a minute, you see if I just do a quick number of records here, we've got the 15 million, right? And now if I'll go to another sheet, and let's just repeat that very quickly for the multi-table approach, and I think you're going to see a substantially radical difference here. Let's drag out the orders here, quick join, and extract. And what we want to do is, again, we're going to define it as a multi-table here. And just go to a sheet. We will be prompted because we haven't saved the workbook yet, but I'll just call it two table here. And as fast as I can almost hit sheet 2 here, you'll see that it's run, just to prove that it's not magic. Here we've got the 15 million rows, and if I go back and look at the underlying here we go. You can see that the differences here in terms of size are radical, right? So we're dealing with orders of magnitude difference between the 1 and the 2 table here. Now, while I'm on the extract topic, what I'd like to do is quickly show you that hybrid best practice combination of using extracts and live connection in conjunction. And what it allows us to do is tackle what, for many of my customers, whether they're the epidemiologists in various health agencies that I work with that are looking at disease outbreaks or prevalence of some type of risk factor, like in New York City, where I spend a lot of my time working with Department of Health and mental health, or even education data, right? They're very consumed, as they should be, around what they call the small n problem. And I alluded to it earlier, where it's the smallest subgroup count that we can have without risking personally identifying information about an individual, right? So the idea here is, from the data quality campaign example, even though I've suppressed, let's say, a particular subgroup demographic, I could very easily back into the number, of course. That's pretty easy, particularly with the total right here in front of me. And then I could start to, whether it's student data or self-harm, suicide type data, whatever type of data it is, I could very quickly start to piece it together in kind of a mosaic effect, right? Where if I have individual pieces of information, I can put that together. So many of my customers are very focused on this particular issue when they're representing data to the public. And so here's a good example of actually the New York Department of Health and what they've done. Actually, a gentleman, George Weatherwax, who's here at the conference, has led this effort. So here I'm at the New York Health Connector site, and they're tracking programs to address very serious issues like suicide and self-harm, looking at it across various geographical breakouts, looking at it, of course, by gender. And then here, just to give you an example of what this looks like here. Hopefully everybody can see this. Maybe I'll just zoom in here a bit. So if, let's say, I've got a map here of New York, and so I can quickly see a hot spot area here where we've got a very high number of hospitalizations. As I select that, I can then quickly see over here on the right that if I look at demographics around that, I can see that for that particular county, that females under the age of 34 here using various poisoning, overdose kind of approaches, unfortunately, is a big problem here in this particular county. But if, let's say, we're focused on a county like Delaware, you'll see here, if we start to drill into the data, we'll get this too small to report. And there are a number of dynamic rules that are being applied in Tableau, some outside of Tableau, of course, some they're doing at the data, but looking at the number of incidents of, let's say, a self-harm or a suicide in conjunction with the overall, like in the case of suicides relative to the overall total deaths for that county, looking at the number of incidents by a demographic, looking at the proportion of that, and et cetera, to dynamically determine if the data gets to a point where I could start to back into it by piecing things together with social media, et cetera. And so that's a problem that, again, healthcare, criminal justice, the example that was shown yesterday from the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice, it's something that many of my customers need to solve. And so I want to show you that how we could build that out quickly in Tableau using that same education data. And the idea here is that I've got an aggregated view of the counts, and if I want to click on a particular ethnicity, I could then drill down directly into the underlying detail, assuming I have the right credentials, and see my favorite Boston sports players. So let me show you exactly how we would do that, just to make sure everybody fully aware of this kind of best practice technique. So first I'm just going to quickly log into SQL Server. Of course, have to have credentials to start with. We're going to use those 3,588 student records. And then what I want to do now is, let's say, one of the things I always start with, number of records. And now we'll just quickly group that like we've been looking at the data: college, major, gender, how about, and ethnicity. And of course, we could do that fine-grained sorting with even the new nested sorted feature now that is so nice, because now we don't have to write those index or rank table calculations to address that. Actually, I want to be down here. There we go. And let me give a little more real estate to pull this. There we go. And then let's say we want to have this on count. Now what I could do is quickly create a calculated field on this number of records here. So I'll just quickly call this my suppression label. And I'll just say if the sum of the number of records here, and if that's greater than what is what I call the minimum n size, which is my parameter. So if this is greater than or equal to, I'm just going to say if greater than or equal to, I'm just going to pull in the parameter here, that minimum n size. That's just a user controlled parameter now. Then some number of records, right? And else, this little trick here, we of course, if we want to like actually have a suppression label, then we could apply a string to the number of records. Otherwise, what we can do is just this little trick here, and that way we can create a custom number format. You know what? And let me make sure that I now realize that might have been a little, just a quick, again, most of my customers are using, and I've got other examples here, if you'd like to see them, where we're using a lot of nested conditional logic here to really compare and look at what we can showcase. I'll just say OK. And then now if I add that, oh, and then let me quickly add the default number format for custom. And what I want to do here is, again, I got a true-false kind of situation. I've got, if I'm above the minimum n size, then display the number. If I'm below, suppress. So I'm just going to quickly create some placeholders here for the numbers. A semicolon will be the indication to Tableau that now I want to just have a suppression label, for example. And now I can just apply this directly to the display, and we can right onto my label here. And now we have the suppression label, and if we change the minimum n size here, let's say from 3 to 2, or actually going down, we're going to suppress less, of course. If we go up, we'll suppress more. And actually what I want to also do is take this and add it up here. Oops, wait. Good thing for undo. I want to actually create another one of these, drag it up here, put it actually on the label so that we don't have the bar either. Of course, what we can do is sometimes just as easy as just hiding the axes, right? If we don't want somebody to see a specific number, and not showing the labels and removing it from the tooltip. So just a quick suppression technique there. Now what I want to do is, first I want to rename this to, well, first I want to duplicate this because I'm going to have a live and an extract version. So I'm just going to say quickly duplicate, and then in this extract version, I'm just going to rename it so it's very clear here, extract, and I'll just call this aggregate data. And then I could do this in one step, but just to really highlight, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hide all unused fields. And that's going to allow me to remove the personally identifiable information that you see in this data source, like Social Security name, salary, is somebody on scholarship. So I'll just say hide all unused fields. And when I do so, you'll notice that I still have the 3,588 rows, row-level data, but I've removed the personally identifiable information. Now if I come in and take and right-click on the actual extract, say extract data, again, this could have been done in one step. You notice now this is grayed out. I'm going to just say aggregate data for visible dimensions so that we're going to remove, and I just get a little warning message saying if it was a semi-additive like a count distinct, there could be potential issues in getting down to that granular level of data. That's fine. In this case, it's not it's a fully additive calculation. And now what I've done is, you see I'm back to the 628 marks for the data here. They represent that unique combination of college, major, gender, and ethnicity. And then because I now have this duplicated live, I'll just call this live, and this could be my PII data, right? And so now when I want to, so from my live, which of course I'm going to be authenticating to the database, now I could create, the most personally identifiable information viz I want, right? I could come in here and maybe I want to look at average SAT scores here, and I want to look at somebody's social security number, first name, last name, are they receiving aid, all the kinds of things that typically we need to be very sensitive to understanding, maybe ethnicity, and then even salary, right? So quickly just going to look at this in a discrete way here just to really hammer this home. So if we even had salary here. And now if we go and we create a, let me just wipe that clean here, now if we came in here and wanted to build this out, we could have that aggregated view, and then we could add the PII level view, right? And maybe we do want this up here. And all we have to do, of course, is link these two here with the use as filter, and we could clean it up, of course, if we wanted to. But now if I want to go look at my 6 favorite Boston sports characters, I could do that, right? And I could actually get down to that personally identifiable information. I didn't get prompted that time for SQL Server. I'm already logged in, but certainly the workflow would be that if we're going from that extract, right, where we don't have the PII information to a view where we have personally identifiable information, a data source, again, this would be going back to the SQL Server data. We'd want to have that authentication check in place. So I'm now just going to quickly go to a couple other examples, suppression examples, and just show them to you. And if you'd like to discuss them further, I would certainly be glad to do so. These are other techniques that I've applied with my customers, whether they're blurring and recoding, so looking at upper range, lower range, and banding those or binning the data into various ranges. So if I go from, let's say, depending on, I'm going to ban and bin based on relation to that min n size, right? So if I drop my min n size down, you see right here, let's do that again. I'll change it back to 5. And notice we're going to, so if the min n size, meaning we're now below it, then we want to actually go to 10% ranges here. So you can see here. And also, another requirement I typically get is I want a whole number, so round that to the nearest whole number, maybe full range recoding, so that we blur the data by putting the data into ranges. Here, for example, we might have a scenario where if we drop our n count down, and if we started to drill, right, the idea is here that with a viz in tooltip simulation here, we could go to one particular major, and we could see the underlying demographic data, whereas if we go to this particular major, we're going to mask, right? So it's going to be dynamic masking. In this particular case, the request was if any of the, as it says right here, if any of the numbers or any of the cells in a particular row drop below the minimum n size, suppress all of them. That's a common requirement I also get as well. So glad to talk about the, well, again, you'll have the workbook. You'll see the level of detail expression that builds that out. Another great one is the use of sets here to allow us to look at a particular, let's say, major, and if the number of students is above the minimum n size, let's say, like here in this case, if I drop this down to 3, you'll see I can display more scholarship information about individual students. If it's below, then aggregate for that entire department. This is just using a set. So if I get bit more extreme and say 30. Now we're aggregating here. And very quickly, I'll just show you how straightforward that is. That's just coming in and creating a set for the, here. So let's say we had each individual student right here, and we could come in and just create a set on, let's say, major here. So come to major, say create set, and I could just come in here and create a condition, right? Could do it by field, but since I've got a parameter, I just want to say when the subgroup count is greater than the min n size, and this just allows me to create a set of majors that, again, then I can display the individual scholarship data with a surrogate key around the student ID. So I'll say OK there, and then now that I've got that set, and I want to create a calculation around that, I could just do a quick if in that set, right? And this is then, that little trick with the negative -01 allowed me to get around this thing of having to create a string for that student ID here. That's a surrogate student ID, else, and now if I want a string, display a string, I'll just call it suppressed, for example, and then I'll just call it calculation 1, and then I'll take that calculation 1 that, oh wait, we got a little error here. What's going on with it? Wait, if, oh yeah, thank you. That would help. Thank you very much. And so now, right. Now that should show up here. Now what I'm going to do is just replace the current student ID with that conditional student ID. And you'll notice here now we've just aggregated that out. And then just to really highlight, I'll just take my set to color. And so this is just another use case requirement that some customers had where they wanted to aggregate or suppress data above and below certain points. Set actions will, as you saw now, make this more efficient. We won't have to be creating the sets in the calculated field. We can do this more in the flow. And we've got some other good examples, but I want to definitely leave time for Q&A here, and then even I'm available to stay after. But other examples of rate suppression, right, where looking at poverty rates, and if you're below a certain, like in this case, state of Tennessee requirement to look at poverty rates when, as long as you're not below the poverty rate number that, so if I change this, let's say to 10,000 individuals living in poverty, and that, now we've just lost Monroe County. And then not only for the aggregate at the county level and the region level, but be able to drill here and look at that across year. I can do so if, again, the poverty threshold is less than any individual year, but the minute I change this and say, well, what about 8,000 here, we lose that ability to show the data at any level. And again, just using a quick level of detail expression. And then you'll see other public examples here that may be of interest, whether it's New York Office of Mental Health. This was an interesting one where they're doing a lot of surveying of their mental health services, and they need to ensure individuals that are filling out that survey that they're totally anonymous, and that data, when it's publicly presented, is truly totally anonymous. So suppression here, as you can see down here, when the number drops below a certain level here, or whether it's Arizona Department of Health Services here, who is displaying opioid data, right, to understand the trend and epidemic proportion around that, or actually the work with the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice, right, to understand, like in this case, you can see down here, we're going to say insufficient data when we don't have sufficient data. So, yeah, and we can, again, the examples go on. Here's the Tennessee. A lot of schools these days are reporting out around student performance, and so they need the ability to dynamically mask data here based on If it's student data, it's going to be FERPA. If it's inmate data, it's CGIS. HIPAA data if it's healthcare. So with that, I think in the interest of time, I want to wrap up. And again, thank you very much for coming. But certainly ask you to reach out if you'd like to talk about these more. I mean, we could talk about how authentication has to work in conjunction with this, how permissioning. There's lots of good presentations around permissioning. I didn't get a chance to touch on permissioning in great detail because that's what those sessions are for. But certainly we want to do things like lock down the data so that it can't be downloaded, lock down the workbook, et cetera. Turn off maybe even command buttons right on the tooltip. But the idea here is various techniques to allow you to either present data to the public or within your own internal organization, but do so in a secure way where that underlying data may be at an individual level highly sensitive, right? But have this, aggregate view. If you then need to go to the detailed data, that's where I would keep it as a live connection for now, certainly until the extract encryption at rest is fully available. But the live connection, leveraging, your back-end database security. Because, of course, that's one thing that I do a lot of, right, is not only configuring the Tableau security capabilities that I've been touching on, but how does Tableau work in conjunction with your security schemes, right? And believe me, I've seen a lot of custom types of authentication approaches that we need to work with, right? And so how do we do that? Using SAML 2.0, typically, other standards to do that. But so with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your time. Glad to take questions here in the public forum. I'll certainly be around. Please grab a card if you'd like to discuss, any aspect of this or other security topics that we didn't get a chance to drill into in detail. But again, I appreciate your time.